Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to our evening presentation, representing and reckoning with early American art. I'm Mindy Visa. I'm the curator of American art and director of fellowships and research here at Crystal Bridges. As we begin, I want to recognize Crystal Bridges' role as settlers and guests in the Northwest Arkansas region. We acknowledge the Caddo, Quapaw, and Osage, as well as the many Indigenous caretakers of this land and water. We appreciate the enduring influence of the vibrant, diverse, and contemporary cultures of Indigenous peoples. We are conscious of the role in colonization that museums have played. As cultural institutions, we have a responsibility to engage in the dismantling of historical and systemic invisibility of Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future. We choose to intentionally hold ourselves accountable to appropriate conversation, representation, connection, and education to facilitate a space of measurable change. Again, thank you for being here in our program this evening. So, representing and reckoning with early American art. It's an honor to welcome you. What we are doing tonight is featuring our scholars from the inaugural Tyson Think Tank program. And this program really started and spun off of our Tyson Scholars of American Art program at Crystal Bridges, thanks to an early gift from the Tyson family and Tyson Foods. We were able to start this program 10 years ago. We'll be celebrating our 10th anniversary next year of the full Tyson Scholars program. Please do look for that application to open in early November. So that's a plug for our full Scholars program. But the Tyson Think Tank was an idea that we had about what could we do in a focused 3-week sprint, really investigating and reaching deep into one question. I'm not going to take much more time telling you anything about that because I want the scholars themselves to do that. But first, a few little housekeeping notes. Whether you're joining us here in Zoom or in Facebook Live, you can certainly tune in using closed caption, which is down on the right-hand side. I also want to thank everyone who made this possible, including Del Monte Foods, Pure Good Price Club, Inc., and of course, the Tyson family and Tyson Foods. So you can take advantage of closed captioning, as I mentioned, and down in the bottom right. Also, please do think about questions. This is meant to be an engaging dialogue going back and forth throughout the talk. The question and answer button is live, so please type in your questions and answers there. And at the very end, we'll have an engaging conversation using those Q&As. So please do that throughout the lecture. And of course, we'll leave time to answer that. Now, I am going to turn this over to Carrie Ribera Barrett, our distinguished scholar who led the Tyson Think Tank and Short-Term Fellowship, as well as Margarita Carsalis, Wendy Castanel, and Alexandra Letbin. I'm going to put into the chat a link to their bios, but I don't want to waste any more time for all the good information that they will share with you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, and enjoy.
Thank you, Mindy. And thanks to everyone who's here. I find these webinars are a little, I can't see you, but I did just scroll through. We've got nearly 100 people between the panelists and all of you who are watching. And I'm so delighted to be virtually back with this very, very close-knit group of think tankers. We were, Mindy told you sort of how this got started. I want to say that for those of you already, a shout out to hoping that this happens again next year. This was absolutely one of the most perfect fellowship opportunities for those of us in museum fields who don't get sabbaticals. So not a full-time fellowship, but a way for me to work with Mindy and people on the staff at Crystal Bridges before I arrived to really carve out the question, which for us is really how to make early American art relevant. That was the central question that I proposed to Crystal Bridges when I applied for a short-term fellowship. We were all in residence together. You'll hear from Margarita, Alexandra, and Wendy after me. And the four of us, we were in close quarters in houses next to each other. And rather than go off into libraries and do our own work, we collaborated in really extraordinary way. This, I said, the reason that I came to Crystal Bridges was all about Frances. 2 other seconds about me. You may know that after a long, long career in American art, in the American wing at the Met, I was kind of kicked upstairs into museum administration, where all of a sudden my world was ancient art and archaeological digs and the Islamic world and cultural property. And when that came to a close for me, it was because I went and I led a garden for 2 years, which was an absolutely delightful experience. But the true confessions, because all of us are friends here, Americanists and others, a close-knit group, there was something about the pandemic year that just pulled my heartstrings back to American art. And as I watched, as I began to be much, much more attentive with the time that I had to look at the way that individual museums across the country, museums like Crystal Bridges, which is completely devoted to American art, and others like, next slide, like Harvard or the Worcester Art Museum, who were looking at approaches to early American art, even as they were expanding the canon. I think about, how long I've been in this field and how relevant was like Lloyd Goodrich's age-old question, sort of, what is American about American art? Or we could rephrase that to be, what is American art? And many, many collections are expanding properly that canon to represent underrepresented pieces of that puzzle, expanding the geography, expanding the makers, BIPOC artists, Native American collections are on the rise across the country. And then what you're seeing here are 2 stories from pre-pandemic, pre-George Floyd's murder, 2019 and 2018, where both at Harvard and at the Worcester Art Museum, connecting colonial portraits to slavery. And the next slide, what we saw at the Nelson Atkins Museum, what we've all seen, is an approach that looks at harm reduction, actually focusing on language. During our think tank, we were delighted, while nothing could be virtual, we were really hoping that while we were in residence during August at Crystal Bridges, that we would be able to invite many of you to come join us to talk to many, many more people. We were able to hold a really terrific kind of afternoon with William Rudolph and his staff at the Nelson Atkins Museum, where they're studying how language hurts, how our labels matter, the kinds of things that are in our audio guides, the kind of tactical representations and interpretations of works of art. And then the next slide. At Crystal Bridges, the 4 of us were welcomed really into a place that is, I say, both to praise them and because it's fabulous, really a think tank already. We the People, Nosotros el Pueblo, is the way that the American collection, which used to be hung in just strict chronological order, the way that collection was formed is now created in a much more sort of, a much more inviting way to look at pictures side by side. Let me go back for a minute and just say that while I proposed a single picture inquiry, wanting to get back to my own past in the interrogation of a work of art, what we proposed then was that 3 fellows would join me. And this was something that Mindy and Taylor, I think, and others at Crystal Bridges had been thinking about for a while. But my proposal was really that I didn't want to just be a fellow on my own. I wanted to create a forum for discussion. And we were able to invite 3 scholars from 3 different institutions, all of whom agreed to work on a single object from early America. And we'll talk in a minute. You'll hear from them, and then we will talk about how we're making these works relevant. In the next slide, please, in the We the People, this is at the tail end. It's funny, this isn't really part of the We the People installation, but it's hard in the Crystal Bridges installation. It's very, very fluid. And so you get Mrs. Theodore Atkinson, Frances Deering Atkinson, next to the other Copley in the collection. I spent, while I was there, many, many hours in the gallery, my focus being on putting the visitor first, rather than me telling, as I've done all my life about this portrait, what would people want to know? And many people asked if they were married. Many people asked if they were married. On the next wall is the next slide. Mrs. Atkinson finds herself in very, very good colonial company with portraits painted, 50 years earlier by Gerardus Duyckinck, the famous Levi Franks family portraits. So I didn't take a picture of both, but you can see from, if you're looking at these, Mrs. Atkinson is to your left. So there's this very clever colonial American corner, which is all about family, about what we might learn. There are lots and lots of animals in these pictures. I'm not telling you anything that you can't see or can't know, but I am sharing with you what most people responded to. It was almost as if they couldn't look at the people in the pictures. They were interested in the bird, the dog, the lamb, all of these various things, the flowers, and we'll get back to Mrs. Atkinson, and then back to Mrs. Atkinson. I do have another slide of her here. Next slide, please. More people were interested in the squirrel than were interested in her. And I started to think about whether it was that they just couldn't, these are questions, they just couldn't look at her. There's this slide that I love, this kind of, as a New Yorker cartoon, easy guys, there's a better way to find out who painted it. This interrogation of a work of art. And I'll say that I haven't spent so much time with one picture by myself and with other people in a gallery for a very, very long time, maybe at no time in my career. I did run upstairs and look at books a lot, talk to the fellows a lot about what I was mostly hearing from other people. This interrogation, by shotgun with the cigarette on the table, this poor painting is tied to the chair, reminded me of another slide, please. Next slide. Nothing new under the sun. This is Marcia Poynton's interrogation of a work of art, something that I used to use when I taught. And as my kind of, not gift to you, but something I think we can all think about, and what the fellows and I talked about was just how important it is to get back to basic questions. We so often, as art historians, jump to conclusions and interpretations when most people in the galleries, somebody said, is this a real painting? What is it? Who made it? A couple people asked, how did it get here? How much did it cost? I knew it came from the New York Public Library and it cost a lot when Alice Walton bought it. Who acquired it? They're interested in other things. What is that frame? What condition is it in? Is there another one? What does it mean? Who is she and why was it made? I also found, and I'm just now delving deeper into this in the next slide, that there is now 20 questions. So this kind of got 20 questions interrogating social media. Now that we're in the age of, what if Mrs. Atkinson was on Instagram? What if she was a TikTok star? How many levels of interpretation would we have to unpack to get to the core of her being? So the next slide, back to her. We end up knowing, I think, rather than, part of this is about relevance. This is a white woman, a wealthy white woman painted by a wealthy white artist. I'd like to say that if she was on Monument Avenue, she would already be taken down. But she remains relevant because she sits in a gallery with something to tell. Does she become more relevant if we tell you that she married her cousin, and then when he died, she married the cousin that she was really in love with 2 weeks later? Kind of a soap opera. Maybe that is a kind of a TikTok star. What if I told you that her dress isn't real and that the squirrel is about to fly away? A couple of people asked if whether the squirrel, next slide, and this is my last slide, if they're both enslaved in some way, or if not enslaved, which is probably not the right way to put it, somehow captured. somehow captured. She, within the Wentworth Atkinson dynasty, marrying cousins, living in a grand house, feeling maybe as kept as the squirrel who's gnawing at these bits of nuts. Are these the kind of stories where people would say, oh, she's real, she's relevant, she has a past? Is it telling you how many slaves she had, which also Crystal Bridges could do? What we ended up with, and maybe we'll get to this in the end, is at we had an every Tuesday think tank day with members of the Crystal Bridges staff and community. And we ended up thinking about this painting would need hundreds of labels in order for us to get everything we wanted to say out on view. The squirrel, the question of enslavement, her own position as a woman in colonial America. And why should we care? She was white and wealthy, so she may be not as relevant to some other stories that we would tell. But really just, I think, the tip of the iceberg on this portrait. And I want to pass now to three other scholars who I think will do the same thing. We all started thinking, not that we would finish our research, but we end up with many, many more questions than the ones we began with, and hoping that we can continue these dialogues in our field. So I want to pass now to Margarita Koussoulas, who will be talking about Anne Hall, a portrait that I've always been fascinated by at the Brooklyn Museum. Over to you, Margarita. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you, Carrie. Good evening. I want to thank all of you for being here today. My name is Margarita Koussoulas, and I'm the Assistant Curator of American Art at the Brooklyn Museum. And before I begin, I would also like to extend my thanks to my fellow fellows, as well as to Mindy, Taylor, and all of my colleagues at Crystal Bridges for making this fellowship experience so memorable. So over the course of the Tyson Think Tank Fellowship, I focused on a single object in the Brooklyn Museum's collection, William Williams's 1766 portrait of Deborah Hall, seen here at left. Commissioned by David Hall Sr., the business partner of Benjamin Franklin and the leading printer and publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette, the British-born artist William Williams painted this trio of portraits at a time of great prosperity for the Hall family. The portraits represent Hall's sons, who would eventually inherit the business upon his death in 1772, and his daughter Deborah, who was of marriageable age. And in 2024, the newly conserved portrait of Deborah Hall will form a major focal point of the Brooklyn Museum's reinstalled American art galleries, featuring new interpretation, as well as an online resource that will accompany the installation. May I have the next slide? The portrait of Deborah Hall has long been regarded by scholars as one of the most finely detailed and iconographically complex paintings of the colonial era. As the art historian Ronald Fleischer has argued, Williams incorporated symbolic elements derived from emblem books, alluding to the young sitter's eligibility for marriage. In the portrait, the fashionably attired Deborah Hall wears an open robe gown adorned with silk ruffles and white lace. She is represented standing before an enclosed formal garden that suggests her protected upbringing and chastity. The rose bush, coupled with the arrow around which the flowers are entwined, symbolize the pleasures and pains of love. Deborah has carefully tended to the pink roses, which appear to be in full bloom, and is about to pluck one of the roses from its stem. May I have the next slide? The flying squirrel on the leash that Deborah holds was both a popular type of pet at the time and an emblem of diligence and patience. The slack chain elegantly threaded through her fingers suggests that the squirrel has been tamed, and Deborah, by extension, has been cultivated for her marital role. Next slide. The ideal of chastity is reinforced by the pictorial narrative depicted in relief at lower left. And here, the artist pictured the myth of Apollo and Daphne, depicting the specific moment wherein Daphne eludes the unwelcome advances of the god Apollo by metamorphosing into a laurel tree. And finally, the trailing vine that cascades over the stone plinth also functions as an emblem of dependency. All of these themes presented symbolically in the portrait conform to broader 18th century constructs of feminine beauty and virtue. While scholars have already addressed this complex iconography, my work expands on prior interpretations to reconsider the portrait of Deborah Hall through the lenses of ability, class, gender, and race. Next slide. During the initial phases of research, I sought out to learn more about the lived experience of the sitter. I discovered that Deborah had passed away only 4 years after Williams had completed the portrait. As you can see on the slide, the burial record at Christ Church in Philadelphia notes that Deborah died on November 1st of 1770. In the annotation, Deborah, daughter of David Hall, indicates that Deborah never married. And further archival research, moreover, has revealed that Deborah may have been in poor health at the time of her death. In a letter written by Deborah's father, David Hall Sr., to Benjamin Franklin in 1770, Hall noted that his 15-year-old daughter, Debbie, had been, quote, seized with the palsy in one side, unquote, the previous summer, and had recovered only after taking in the healing baths in Bristol. And in the same letter, he notes that his eldest son, William, was learning the printing business, and that his wife, too, had been in a, quote, poor state of health for 14 years, unquote. This information not only casts the sitter in a new light, but it also complicates our reading of the portrait. Indeed, Deborah was 11 rather than 15, as is commonly believed by scholars at the time the portrait was painted. Next slide, please. Over the course of the fellowship, I sought to learn more about the medical meanings of palsy in 18th century Philadelphia. Identified then as a kind of paralysis, palsy, I discovered, figures really prominently in the era's discourses on health and disease. I learned that Franklin himself proposed the use of electricity for palsy treatment, and both Franklin and the surgeon Benjamin Rush, who delivered a series of lectures in the early 1800s on fevers, were both proponents of the medicinal properties of the Bristol bath, the iron-rich mineral springs that Deborah had visited in the year before her death. In the future, I hope to engage more deeply with disability studies to consider the social construction of disability at that time. These conversations remain as important as ever as we reconsider our interpretation of colonial era objects and American art more broadly through the lenses of diversity, equity, inclusion, and especially access. And my hope is that we might utilize the portrait of Deborah Hall to facilitate important conversations in the museum's galleries around ideas of the quote unquote normative body, as well as power and privilege. Next slide, please. Engaging with issues of race and representation will also allow for more complex and meaningful encounters with early American portraiture. Although William Williams is a highly enigmatic figure who is perhaps best remembered as the teacher to Benjamin West, we know that he participated in debates about slavery and abolition in the 18th century. Born in 1727 in Bristol, England, then a major port for transatlantic slavery, Williams left England as a teenager. And as the art historian Susan Rather has demonstrated, Williams was coerced into working as a sailor on the Virginia trade, which forcibly exported enslaved individuals between Africa, the West Indies, and Virginia. Williams later deserted his post and relocated to Philadelphia in 1747. In addition, Williams also authored a semi-autobiographical novel, The Journal of Penrose Seaman, loosely based on his travels at sea, in which he expressed abolitionist sentiments as the titular character. After a brief residence in Jamaica between 1760 and 1763, Williams eventually moved to New York in 1769 and returned permanently to England in 1776 during the outbreak of the American Revolution. Next slide. Williams's views on abolition are suggested in his early but powerful portrait of Benjamin Lay, a Quaker activist who offered searing critiques of slavery over the course of his lifetime. After moving from Barbados to Philadelphia in 1731, Lay became a key figure in the emerging anti-slavery movement prior to the Revolutionary War. And this portrait was commissioned by none other than Benjamin Franklin, who had published Lay's anti-slavery tract in 1737. What I find so striking about this commission is that Franklin himself was an enslaver who had only become more vocal about the abolition of slavery toward the end of his life. And tax records also reveal that David Hall Sr. and later Deborah's own brother, William, had also enslaved multiple people. And so in the Brooklyn Museum's galleries, we might bring this context to bear on our interpretation and understanding of Deborah Hall, incorporating additional objects from the collection in order to explore the visual histories and legacies of slavery and abolition from the 18th century to the present day. Next slide, please. Finally, this painting has a fascinating history of condition issues and conservation. As you can see on the slide, when Deborah Hall came into the Brooklyn Museum's collection in 1942, it was in an extremely fragile and deteriorated state, with severely lifting paint layers and extensive areas of loss. Although all three portraits remained in the family from the 1760s until the 1930s, the portrait of Deborah Hall was relegated to a different area within the family home, where it was exposed to extreme fluctuations of temperature and humidity. According to a letter in the Brooklyn Museum's curatorial file, a family member indicated that she had, quote, "never seen this portrait of Deborah in good condition. What happened to her in her youth, I cannot say, but David and William were always in fine shape, and they had a very prominent place in my grandfather's old house in Salem when I was a very small child, and of course for several generations before that," unquote. And indeed, the condition of Deborah Hall, like the very iconography embedded within the portrait, is inextricably linked to issues of gender. And ultimately, the varying conditions of the three portraits led to their dispersal to two different institutions. The portraits of William and David Hall Jr. were purchased by Henry Francis DuPont in 1940, while Deborah Hall was purchased for the Brooklyn Museum in 1942. Next slide. When I began research on Deborah Hall in 2018, I worked very closely with the Brooklyn Museum's paintings conservators and with our colleagues at Winterthur, all of whom are actively working on the conservation treatment of the three portraits of the Hall siblings. And this research has really evolved over time, taking me into so many different and really surprising directions. At first glance, Deborah Hall might seem rather conventional as a portrait of a young white woman of wealth and privilege, whose experiences appear far removed from those of our present day audiences. And yet the painting is far more complex than it initially appears. Along with my cohort of think tank fellows, I'm interested in thinking about how we might deepen visitors' engagement with early American art, creating meaningful connections between the omnipresent issues of the colonial past, namely Eurocentrism and structural racism, and our contemporary moment. And over the course of the fellowship, we also discuss the possible outcomes of this research, as well as problems of interpretation, including how to best capture and distill complex information for different viewers and different contexts. And one of my goals for the reinstallation is to engage audiences in close looking. At the moment, I'm envisioning an interactive touchscreen in the galleries that allows visitors to click on a select area of the portrait to learn more about the painting's symbolism. The online resource, however, will provide a much deeper dive into the portrait. Here, we can bring the conservation treatment alive for visitors through the inclusion of video footage of the process and images of materials, techniques, and scientific analyses. Additional essays and videos will provide multiple entry points into the portrait. For instance, we might enlist a fashion historian to address Deborah Hall's clothing, a medical historian to discuss palsy in the 18th century, and a contemporary artist to offer insights into the portrait as it relates to their artistic practice. Perhaps Micheline Thomas or Amy Sherald, both of whom center Black women in their portraiture in order to explore issues around gender, the gaze, fashion and self-presentation, and African-American identity. And finally, with my colleagues at Crystal Bridges, we also talked about the success of a podcast format that allows information to unfold in sequential episodes in a way that builds suspense for the audience. I believe that utilizing this combination of digital and interpretive strategies will not only allow us to highlight the importance of Deborah Hall, but also to illustrate the complexity and relevance of early American portraiture for our visitors. Thank you so much. I will look forward to your comments and questions. And now I will pass it off to Wendy.
Thanks, Margarita. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. And I'd like to start by thanking Mindy Bisa, Taylor Pectal, and the IT team at Crystal Bridges for their help with organizing and running the program tonight. I'd also like to thank the staff at Crystal Bridges for their amazing hospitality and everyone who participated in our think tank discussions while we were in residence, especially my cohort, Carrie, Margarita, and Alexandra. It was wonderful working alongside all of you. I used my 3 weeks participating in the Tyson Scholars think tank in early American art, researching the portrait of Nicolas Augustin Metoyer in the Church of St. Augustine from 1830. The life-size oil on canvas painting measures 80 inches high by 53 inches wide and is signed by J. Fouy, who has been identified as an itinerant painter working throughout Louisiana in the mid-19th century, but about whom little else is known. However, of Fouy's rare extant paintings, the portrait of Metoyer is the most extraordinary. In it, Metoyer is depicted in full length and fills the center of the canvas. He is dressed in a day suit that was typical of 19th century Louisiana planters, with a pleated white high-collared shirt, a black waistcoat and cravat, and topped with a long jacket and slacks. The suit is neat and fashionable, but doesn't include any unnecessary embellishments like embroidery, fine fabrics, or jewelry. In his left hand, Metoyer clutches a large planter's hat that would have provided shade as he worked. Metoyer's brown skin, which displays the wrinkles of age, is offset by a mane of fluffy white curls. He confidently meets the viewer's gaze as he proudly gestures beyond the green curtain, which has been pulled back to reveal the small white structure of St. Augustine Catholic Church in the middle ground. Metoyer himself is firmly planted on a black and white marble tile floor and in front of a white balustrade with 2 large Tuscan columns peeking from beneath the curtain. However, despite the physical distance between Metoyer and the church alluded to by the artist, the two remain tied together by Metoyer's gesture, which places his hand directly in front of the church's entrance, as well as the dirt path that leads the viewer's eye from the church to the space inhabited by the sitter. The size, scale, and confidence of the Black subject of this portrait, as well as the cost to commission such a painting, renders this work unique in the history of American art. I have not been able to locate any similar life-size portraits of Southern planters of any race. Next slide, please. The extremely unusual subject and composition of the portrait leads to questions about who Nicolas Augustin Metoyer was. Why did he commission this portrait? As a Black man in the antebellum South, how was he in a position to purchase such a painting? Why did he choose to be represented in this fashion? My work at Crystal Bridges was an attempt to clarify and answer some of those questions. Nicolas Augustin Metoyer was a resident of the community of Iberville in Natchitoches Parish in northwestern Louisiana. Next slide, please. Metoyer was the oldest son of Quanquan, a woman who was born enslaved, and Claude Thomas Pierre Metoyer, a white officer in the French and then Spanish colonial army in Louisiana. As a young woman, Pierre Metoyer leased Quanquan's services to work in his home. Eventually, they had 10 children together, and Metoyer manumitted Quanquan, providing her with a parcel of land. Quanquan worked extraordinarily hard, hunting bears to sell their oil, starting a tobacco and possibly indigo plantation on the land that she was gifted, and using her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies passed down from her mother to practice healing in the Ile Brevel community. She applied her efforts to purchase the freedom of her children, and soon they joined her on the plantation. In 1794, Quanquan applied for and received a Spanish land grant to acquire additional land and made her final land purchase in 1807. She and her children worked together to cultivate this property, and together, the family amassed the largest plantation in the region. Next slide. It is through the toil and ingenuity of Quanquan, as well as the lenient manumission laws in colonial Louisiana, that laid the groundwork for the success of the Metoyer family. By the time Nicolas Augustin Metoyer commissioned this portrait, the Metoyer family had become the most successful and profitable planters in Natchitoches. They were respected as important community leaders across racial boundaries. Additionally, as the oldest son and family patriarch, Nicolas Augustin was the family's representative and the de facto leader of the Ile Brevel Society. He demonstrated his social standing and position by building the Church of St. Augustine, which was the first permanent Catholic church in the community. Next slide, please. Catholicism had been the official religion practiced in the region since the French established the outpost of Natchitoches in 1714. The French demanded that the Catholic faith was the only religion allowed in its colony. The Spanish colonizers who took control of the territory from the French in 1762 maintained Catholicism as the sole religion that could be openly practiced. Hence, the residents of the Ile Brevel were Catholic, including the enslaved, who were required by law to be baptized into the faith and to attend Mass every Sunday. However, there had never been a permanent church structure built in Natchitoches for services until Metoyer commissioned St. Augustine in the 1820s. The church was built directly behind his plantation on land that he donated. Moreover, the Metoyer family occupied the front pews of the church, seated ahead of the white parishioners, and clearly signifying the status of this remarkable family. Next slide, please. This explains Metoyer's choice to commission this portrait that so carefully links him to St. Augustine Catholic Church. This also clarifies the spatial arrangement of the portrait. Metoyer is evidently depicted standing at the front of his plantation house and looking across his lawn to the church, which was constructed as a result of his own philanthropy, and which is situated on land donated by him to serve the community. In this way, the portrait is reminiscent of Charles Willson Peale's The Artist in His Museum from 1822. Just as Peale depicted himself in a full-length portrait, sweeping back a red curtain to reveal a space that he created, built to display and educate the public with his collection of uniquely American objects, Metoyer likewise proudly shows off his creation. His altruism has brought a central place of worship to his devoutly Catholic community. The portrait, therefore, creates the impression that Metoyer considered the church to be the crowning achievement of his hard work and success. Next slide, please. The only other example of a full-length portrait that I could find from Louisiana is Edmund Brewster's 1822 portrait of Père Antoine at age 74. The painting depicts Antonio de Sedella, commonly known in New Orleans as Père Antoine, who was in charge of the Catholic Church there from 1774 until he was replaced after the Louisiana Purchase. He remained in New Orleans until his death in 1829 and was well known for his kind treatment of prisoners, as well as his work baptizing the enslaved. Next slide, please. The pendant portraits of Jean Ursin and Octavine Jarreau by Louis-Antoine Colas from 1826 are much more typical of the types of portraits that were commissioned by Louisiana's wealthy planter class. They commonly hired French-born or trained artists to paint bust portraits in the French academic style, which included an austerity that focused the viewer's attention on the face and comportment of the sitters. Moreover, these sitters usually were depicted wearing their finest clothing and jewelry, with their hair fashionably arranged. For example, the Giraud sitters are both painted with curled hair. Additionally, Jean Ursin wears a ruby shirt pin, while Octavine's attire includes diamond and emerald earrings, as well as a matching necklace and brooch. And finally, her fashionable dress is topped with a gold buckled red belt at her waist. Next slide, please. Metoyer makes a different choice, however. Instead of posing in his finest attire, he wears plainer clothes. The suit is certainly in the current style, but there have been no luxurious adornments added to display his elegant taste and wealth in the portrait. Most significantly, the hat he holds at his side is a style that planters wore when they rode out into the fields, an unexpected and deliberate inclusion in a formal portrait. The hat is illustrated, for example, on the head of the figure on the left in John Tenniel's illustration, The Jamaica Question from 1865. Its large size and wide brim. Sorry, I lost my presentation. Its large size and wide brim I apologize for that. I'm having technology issues, but my paper is up again now. Its large size and wide brim were designed to shield planters' faces from the hot sun. Metoyer seems to be using this portrait to represent himself as a community leader, a devout Catholic, but also as a hard worker. He sets himself apart from the typical portraits of his class by avoiding lavish clothing. Instead of displaying his amassed wealth, then, Metoyer has chosen to display his philanthropy. He does this by insisting that the painting remains focused on his patronage of the church in the background and the land on which it sits, a land that Metoyer had a thorny relationship to as an enslaved laborer, as a free property owner and worker, and as a planter who owned approximately 180 enslaved men, women, and children. Next slide, please. Finally, this land was originally occupied by the Natchez people, who had been brutally exterminated in the early 18th century by the French as a result of a series of wars fought for the land. Enslaved Africans often fought on both sides of this conflict as a way to earn their own freedom, either through running away to be taken in by the Natchez and their indigenous allies, or as a result of French manumission in return for their service as soldiers in the colonial militia during the Natchez Wars. The long and bloody history of the land, therefore, becomes yet another complex layer in this portrait's meaning and function. Ultimately, the portrait crafts a story that underscores the convoluted racial and social relationships and identities in 18th and 19th century Louisiana. Thank you. And now I'll pass the baton to our last speaker, Alexandra Letvin.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm not sure if my video is working. It's not showing up on my screen. There we go. I want to begin by thanking everyone at Crystal Bridges and particularly Mindy Besaw and Taylor Pechtel for the opportunity to participate in this pilot program. It was such a pleasure to join the welcoming environment at Crystal Bridges and engage in rich discussions, both with staff members and my fellow think tankers, Carrie, Margarita, and Wendy. My project centered around the Bentley Symonds Runyon family, a painting in the Allen Memorial Art Museum's collection by Frederick Cohen, a little known painter born in England who was active in Detroit between 1837 and 1855, and then traveled throughout northern Ohio between 1855 and 1858. In the foreground, we see a family lined up as if across a stage. Behind them is an expansive plot of land enclosed by a white fence that protects it from the forested wilderness encroaching on either side. This contrast between wilderness and order is made more striking by the fact that the land is incredibly well manicured and maintained. This is clearly new landscaping, and we can tell that because many of the trees are so small that they still have cages around their bases for protection. On the land and to the right, we see a large green Greek Revival house. The empty trellises along the house await new plant growth, a sign of optimism in the land and the family's future in their home. Bentley Symonds Runyon, the proud patriarch of this family portrait, was born in Knox County, Ohio in 1821. In 1847, he moved slightly north to Mansfield, where he became a hardware merchant and a civic leader. He was one of the founders of the Mansfield Gas Light Company, which introduced gas lighting to the town. He also served one term as mayor and was an active member and officer of the Richland County Agricultural Society. I'm going to assume that many of our attendees had not heard of Mansfield until today. If I could have the next slide, please. As you can see here, it's in north central Ohio. It's the little black box. It's about 50 miles southwest of Oberlin and 80 miles southwest of Cleveland. It was founded in 1808 on land made newly available to the US government as part of the 1805 Treaty of Fort Industry, which is the treaty that also paved the way for the founding of Oberlin in 1833, which you can see in area 53 of the map with, I see a little stray N, I'm sorry about that. Appropriately enough, Mansfield was named after Jared Mansfield, who was the Surveyor General of the United States between 1803 and 1812, and was charged with extending the survey of land in the Northwest Territory. While initially a small town, Mansfield expanded substantially in the mid-1800s, thanks largely to a new railroad that connected it to Sandusky up on Lake Erie. And by 1846, there were over 2,300 residents with 2 newspaper offices, 23 stores, and 7 churches. If I could have the next slide, please. By all accounts, then, by the time that Runyon moved to Mansfield, it was a booming city. And indeed, in an 1856 map made just 1 year before our painting was made, indicates that Runyon's house stood near the center of town, and that's the blue box that you see on your screen. If I could have the next slide, please. But Cohen depicts Runyon as if imposing order on land recently cleared for him. Indeed, while the painting's current title, The Bentley Symonds Runyon Family, foregrounds its human figures, it might also be characterized as a portrait of a house and the land on which it sits. So we could just say that the Runyons were boasting or exaggerating in this portrait, but we could also ask how this painting reinforces a particular mindset about the land that's now Ohio through the version of history that it presents and what it chooses to exclude. And if I could have the next slide, please. This question has been at the forefront for me at the Allen this past year, as I've worked very closely with my colleague Hannah Werta-Kinney, our curator of academic programs, on an installation and series of multimodal programs titled Dispossession, which is an external manifestation of an internal process of writing and refining a land acknowledgement for the museum. The installation examines the ways that museums and works of art are complicit in histories of dispossession, and it explores how dispossession and possession are inextricably linked. In the fall semester, which you can see part of here, we investigate the role that canonical American art has played in perpetuating myths about the land that reinforce a settler colonial mindset. In the spring, we will foreground the extractive enterprises on which most modern museums are founded and have grown, from oil drilling to colonial expeditions. Through a series of programs, which you can see here, we also are encouraging a range of different ways to engage with the installation and the project, from peer-to-peer dialogues to gallery talks and across campus conversation, asking what it means to acknowledge the land from a variety of different perspectives across campus. If I could have the next slide, please. Depicting a settler colonial family that benefited from the same treaty that allowed for Oberlin's founding, Cohen's painting allows us to move from considering general histories of dispossession to local ones. It forms the centerpiece of our series, and we expect to eventually pair the painting with a land acknowledgement. My time at Crystal Bridges allowed me to pursue research on this painting in 3 new directions. If I could have the next slide, please. So one primary avenue for research was thinking about visual comparisons for this type of hybrid image that's a portrait of people, but it's also a portrait of land and a house. And I found that the most compelling examples were European rather than American, in the genre of conversation pieces or informal group portraits popular in the 18th century. And thinking about these formal compositional echoes helps foreground how the Runyon family presents themselves in the manner of landed European elites in Ohio. And indeed, Mansfield clearly had European aspirations. Runyon's hardware store itself was directly across from the aspirationally named European Hotel. At the same time, it's telling that while in the British examples, we generally see the house in the center of the composition, in Cohen's painting, it appears on one side with land on the other, suggesting a different emphasis on the value or importance of land in relation to the estate. If I could have the next slide, please. Of course, this makes a good amount of sense as Cohen himself was British. And a second avenue of research while I was part of the think tank program was digging a little deeper into Cohen's biography and some of his known works. In particular, works that engaged with founding American myths, such as the Landing of the Pilgrims, which was actually made in response to critiques that he did not depict enough scenes celebrating American history, prompted me to think more critically about what role the artist's identity and agency should play in how we understand and interpret our painting. And if I could have the next slide, please. And finally, I so enjoyed the many conversations I was able to have with colleagues in the think tank and across Crystal Bridges about interpretive strategies for the painting. And one question that came up in some of our group discussions was how to include layered information in museums beyond a traditional label. And this has led me in recent weeks to wonder if the most effective label for this painting is a few paragraphs of text, as it is now, or if supplementary material, perhaps a map of the land cessions in Ohio, a map of the city of Mansfield, or even census data showing a jump in the value of Runyon's real estate from 2,200 in 1850 to 25,000 in 1860 might be more thought-provoking for our viewers by giving them archival information about the painting that allows them to think for themselves and draw their own conclusions. Conversations with Samantha Best, Stace Treat, and Clay Bacher at Crystal Bridges further helped me think about paths into the painting from the standpoint of the environment and sustainability. If I could have the next slide, please. Comparing our painting to an 1880s photograph of the house, Clay was able to identify a wide range of different plant life, some native to Ohio, such as the hickory that's in front of the house in the photo and along the side, both in the photo and in the painting, and also non-native plants, such as the Lombardy poplars in the wilderness area to the right of the house, which evoke a European garden. And we can also compare what seems to be productive uses of land for agriculture in the background with the more decorative use of land and of trees in the front yard. And having this information and also Crystal Bridges' exemplary model of integrating the natural environment with our understanding of art has helped me think more about different programming opportunities and ways to activate the painting in connection with the land of Oberlin From asking what the landscape of Northeast Ohio was like before white settlement, to how our ideas surrounding the controlling of nature and the idea of a perfect lawn has changed over time. And with that, I conclude, and I invite my fellow think tankers to rejoin me.
Here we go. Thank you all so much. I feel almost as if we're back. Almost as if we're back. We wanted to just take a couple moments amongst ourselves, like a panel before we turn. We have about 15 minutes left. And I wanted to ask each of you fellow think tankers about, just in a nutshell, your presentations really did capture relevance for early American art. But since I feel like that was really the focus of what we were doing, how you all in teaching and museums are making works of art relevant that might seem very irrelevant right now. So maybe just a quick answer from each of you, either an example of what you're doing in your teaching or in your museum, or just what your thoughts are. How can we recommend to our colleagues here how to emphasize relevance for early American art? Margarita, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can start us off. Thank you, Carrie. So I would say, I've been thinking a lot about the various strategies that we might employ in the future, and in particular in thinking about the portrait of Deborah Hall. And I think one of my strategies has been to think about the sitter and how we might animate the life of the sitter, in this instance, Deborah Hall, for our visitors, and to focus on their lived experiences as well. And I think that's just a way of getting visitors to connect, I think, on a deeper level with the portrait, and to look beyond some of the subject matter. And, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think drawing on a variety of methodological approaches has also been really useful in expanding the way I think about Deborah Hall, using methodologies like thinking about disability studies, for instance, and thinking about making connections between the past and the present, which is really inherent to our mission at the Brooklyn Museum, but it's also something that's very important to me as a scholar. And I think that visitors to the museum really, they respond very well to those kinds of connections and how we make the art of the past salient for the now. And then the final thing I'll say is that I thought a lot about provenance as well. And at the Brooklyn Museum, a lot of our visitors are really interested in digging deep into that history. And I think with Deborah Hall and with the portraits of the two brothers, there is such an interesting story to be told. And in thinking about the gendered implications of the fact that Deborah Hall was sort of abandoned in a different space within the family home, and how that painting suffered neglect while the others did not. And so there's so many sort of layers of information just in terms of thinking about the provenance of the work. And I think it's our goal in the future to include all of that information in our reinstalled American art galleries.
Thanks, Margarita. Wendy, what are your thoughts? Relevance as you leave the think tank and you jump back into teaching.
Well, I think that studying early American art is very important, both to teaching, but to scholarship as well, because it allows scholars to unpack the layered histories of early America that go beyond the narratives that we're taught in school, particularly K through 12 education, to show that different regions beyond New England contributed to the life and culture of America. Different colonial founders and the enslaved people who were brought here all contributed to creating a culture beyond the Anglo-American culture that we are more likely to be taught in school. So my work in particular emphasizes the contributions of people of African descent, whether they were enslaved or free, and also from a place that was originally French and Spanish colonial territory. And so it complicates the American art canon and our understanding of American art, as well as American history. And when I teach American art, likewise, I try to include all of the players and not just center the conversation on white male heroes.
And Alexandra, how about you? Relevance.
I think particularly in the case of this painting, it allows us to make a really clear connection between a past and a present that allows our visitors and particularly our students to have a real sense of place. That this is, both a painting that's on the wall in our museum, but it's also an invitation to be thinking about the land on which they're standing, the land that they're living on as they attend college. And so I think finding ways of kind of having that conversation is really important. And as I was mentioning to Margarita a little earlier, I had the opportunity to teach with this painting today for 75 minutes. And it was amazing for 75 full minutes to have, about 15 first-year students so engaged with the painting and, really kind of shocked by seeing that city map that shows, no, this painting is a lie, actually, and how can we unpack that? And how does that change how we would approach this painting? And one thing that I said to them, which I said to you all as well, is that, when I first saw this painting, I just walked past it every day for a long time and didn't think much of it. And for me now, I think the challenge is precisely how to get people to stop and take notice and not just walk past something because we think it doesn't have something to offer us, but instead to see the arguments that it's making.
I want to answer myself really briefly and pivot to another question for us. But I think I also want to answer Robin Grossbeck, I hope I'm saying your name right, who's in the audience, asked a question about surprising things that I learned. And I'm going to admit that in my pre-work before the think tank and during those 3 weeks, I actually took a lot of discipline. I actually read and researched as little as possible. And what I discovered about the painting, I'll just recap, was what I learned from visitors, spending hours and hours over weekends and then on open days, talking to them about it. And what I asked, is there anything surprising that I learned about her? First, I'll say, because I didn't completely keep myself out of the libraries and what I was looking at before, is that she was quite the scandal. And some of us might have known that before, nothing new under the sun. When you go through the Crystal Bridges file, it's all there, that even though she married Theodore Atkinson, when Jonathan Wentworth, her true love, came home, he moved in next door, all that kind of thing. He could see what they were doing. She made sure that their bedroom and their parlor had the draperies open. This is all written in accounts of the day. You would never get that from the picture. I don't know if that makes things more relevant, that we say she was actually, she was actually how that would make her relevant now, to say that she was naughty, maybe makes her more relevant. But it does lead me to, I think, the second question, how to decenter the institutional voice. I would also call that the expert's voice. And share multiple perspectives. The surprising thing that wasn't maybe quite such a surprise for me with Mrs. Atkinson was exactly what Alexandra was just saying, so that no one was really interested in her. People that walk through museums now, I think, are trying to find themselves. It's where we all are, right? Thanks to social media and the way that we respond to images, things we read, things we feel, things we see, we bring our own relevance. So I'm not answering the question, I'm going to pose it to all of you, but how to decenter that so that, as I said before, I spent my whole career giving tours of Copley and Gilbert Stuart and Thomas Sully and every other picture that I could at the Met, at the end of which people would say, thank you for your knowledge. I never once said, how does this picture make you feel? Why did you take this tour? What is it about this picture that engages you and your life? That's my answer about both decentering and the surprising thing. Because when I asked people about what is it about this picture that engages you, they all said the squirrel. They couldn't relate to her in any sort of meaningful way. And this is people of all ages and colors and families and just normal people who came, regular people, visitors who came through Crystal Bridges. So part of it, I think, is going to take us to maybe step down from the expertise a little bit I don't know, what do you all think? What are the motives that we can all use in labels, gallery talks, however it is that we're positioning works of art to allow to decentralize, to decenter the institutional voice, that know-it-all voice? What are you all going to do? Who wants to go
Carrie,
first?
you're sort of gesturing to it by talking about the fact that you were in the museum's galleries and you were asking visitors what they thought about the portrait.
Yeah.
I think we collectively discussed the fact that we would want to take a more community-centered, visitor-centered approach to the work that we're doing. And we talked, Carrie, about even the possibility of writing many different labels for our individual works of art that would take a different sort of, address a different facet of the portrait, 6 to 8 different labels, putting them on view in the galleries and asking visitors to weigh in on which perspective they found most useful or most salient. So I think taking that kind of visitor feedback into account is really significant. I think, at Brooklyn, we're doing front end evaluations. We're looking at focus groups for the installation in the future. And one thing that has come up for us is the possibility of including disability advocates or people with disabilities in those focus groups, and to actively include them in that kind of creation of content, and in terms of soliciting feedback regarding their interpretation of these works. So I think, there are a number of strategies, of course, the digital features that we talked about, enlisting other people to offer their perspective on a work, and sort of decentering our expertise, I think, is one way of getting at it.
Thank you. Wendy, what are you thinking? I can tell you.
Work. I think that the best way to decenter the institutional voice is to be more inclusive in what you choose to, in my context, what you choose to teach, how you teach American art. I always start with Indigenous art when I teach my American art survey. And I try to include units on women, people of color, as well as labor and things like that when I'm teaching American art, so that it does not just use like the traditional American art canon. And I think that's a way to undermine the institution that has formed the canon, and to reach students who can make those connections. If we're talking about immigration and looking at the Ashcan School, they can make those connections to contemporary politics and current debates over things like immigration. And so by, first of all, being more inclusive, and secondly, by relating the events of the past to things that are ongoing issues or questions or debates in the contemporary landscape that they are familiar with, that's the best way I know to decenter the institution and instead highlight different narratives about American art.
Alexandra, you're agreeing, you're nodding.
Yeah, I don't feel like I have too much that I can add after my illustrious think tankers. I think one thing that we had spoken about as a group, which we actually implemented here for the first time with our installation Dispossession, is that we signed our labels. And this was something that we went back and forth about whether or not we wanted to do that. But we felt like in the end, it was important to make it clear that there was a person making these decisions. It was not, again, it was not an institutional voice, but that this is my perspective. And I look at this work and this is what I see as hopefully a way to invite others to read the label, but also take away from their experience looking at the work, their own perspective and their own opinions.
Wow, thank you. We have, as always, just a few minutes left. I want to invite each of the panelists to see if there's a particular question that we know that the questions are so good and will be archived at Crystal Bridges so that we can look at them again. Let me answer really quickly to Ivy. Thanks for the question. And what I started out by saying, but probably not clearly enough, is that we as a group, I know, applaud all of the work, all of the effort that's going on across the country. It will mean changes in acquisition policies, changes in the way American wings are displayed at the Met, where I was until 2018. Putting the Diker collection of Native American art in the American wing was a tough subject, but it's there and it's wonderful. And Sylvia and the curators there are doing great work with it. This is happening it takes expansive acquisition policies. It takes mining museums. Some museums are finding collections that had been not shown before. This project was deliberately, we were kind of saying, but what about the chronological surveys of paintings that are existing? Someone else is asking about landscape, decorative arts. Every museum that we know is filled with a canon that isn't representative. So that not only has to be expanded, but we also have to put new lenses on early American art, which was our 3-week intense project. But any of the rest of you want to quickly answer a question? There's just a few. We didn't get a whole lot of questions, which is great. Probably everybody's hungry.
Well, I think we might go back to Amy Torbert's question, which I think she's also kind of asking about different genres. And it was something that we remarked upon, that we really appreciated that everybody in the think tank was working on a portrait of some sort, right? And it was nice to have that kind of interaction between our topics, but that I think at the same time, we also all felt that this object-centered approach was one kind of possible way into thinking about how we could talk about landscapes or still lifes, et cetera.
But also, Alexandra, I think we also talked about the fact that our paintings were in some ways hybrid images, right? The fact that they were portraits, but they were people in a landscape, and we didn't really know in particular with your work, like how to identify it, how to talk about it. So that's also an interesting idea as well.
Yeah, and it was nice. I think the interplay of those different topics meant that looking at your painting, Margarita, that, you know, we started to think about the land or the garden in a different way than we might have otherwise.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. We're going to finish 1 minute early. There's so much more to be said and thought. I know that this group, if we keep our heads above water, is planning on maybe revisiting a year later at next year's Art Historians of American Art Conference, which will be at Crystal Bridges. Hopefully we can all be there in person, talking about some of these subjects and revisiting kind of where we are a year later, maybe with more of you helping us on this really important subject. I want to thank everyone for coming. Keep in touch with Crystal Bridges. I know that Mindy and colleagues are going to do this again. So it was just such a great August to be with all of you and to now be sharing what we've done. So I thank you all for your attention tonight. Everyone should be a fellow at Crystal Bridges. It's just delightful, just absolutely delightful. I miss you all very much, the three of you, and we'll see you soon. And thanks to all of you who joined us tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. Good night.
Bye-bye.